Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are here live for our second ever episode of Potty Talk at MASSTC. We are the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Technology Center. We are your hosts. My name is Alexi.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Emily Michelle.
And today we are going to talk about the history and the science of pollution and wastewater. Before we jump in, thank you so much for sending your questions ahead of time. We got some really amazing feedback from folks. And we have great fodder for future episodes, which we can talk about maybe at the end of the podcast. And we've taken care to weave in any of your questions on the topics of history and science into today's presentation. So stay tuned for that. All right, so let's kick off with the history. I figured that it would be kind of fun to go into more of like a story time for the beginning of this. And I want to talk about the history of wastewater going back thousands of years. Because what's really interesting is that a lot of the technology that we rely on today is really just modified versions of wastewater technology that was used 5,000 or more years ago. So over 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, they already had clay pipes where they would bring sewage and bring it onto their agricultural fields. So not only piping their wastewater away from their cities, but also reusing the nutrients in wastewater. There were other civilizations like in the Indus Valley 2,000 or 3,000 years ago that had brick toilet seats and also clay pipes. Then there's the Roman Cloaca Maxima. This is actually one of the oldest sewers still being used to date, and it was built 600 BCE. So that's over 2,000 years ago. That's incredible.
That's wild.
Yeah.
You'd think we'd be so much more advanced and, with the everything that we have today. And it's just similar to, what we were doing in the past.
It's really
they figured it out.
Yeah. It's like a slight modification. I mean, the Romans had a sewer system. Ancient Egyptian civilizations actually had cesspits, which, as we know, on Cape Cod and also in other kind of rural parts of America, cesspits and cesspools were common into the 1960s and beyond, and even in some places still today. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of crazy to think that our wastewater technology hasn't changed all that much. But moving into kind of modern times, so our modern wastewater technology history begins in the 19th century, so like 1850s-ish. In London, where there was a lot of disease, and this was primarily because there was a lot of human waste and sewage in the streets.
Is this when there was like cholera outbreaks and
I'm sure there were
typhoid Mary and all of the intestinal bacteria that you think about, that we don't have to worry about so much anymore.
All of that, all of those things.
Days.
Yeah. But so people were getting sick and they had sewage in the streets, and there was also a lot of flooding. So you can imagine that like rainwater and flooding adding to all that sewage made people really just incredibly sick. And so the first kind of modern sewer that we see comes about in London. And it was an incredible scientific feat. People became less sick. I mean, it didn't eradicate all of disease, but it was really helpful. And then we started seeing sewers pop up in Paris, in Boston, in Chicago, and in many other major cities across the world, really. But there were also places like Cape Cod and kind of more rural places that never saw the centralized infrastructure. So we'll talk a little bit about what's been used instead. And this is kind of an opportunity to bring the focus to Cape Cod. So in Cape Cod, our wastewater history really starts taking shape right after World War II. And right after World War II, we see for the first time ever the rise of an American middle class. And so for the first time, people can afford to take days off. They can afford to take their families on vacation and buy cars. And we can finally build roads. So after World War II, roads are built kind of extending into the Cape. And middle-class families come to flock here for summer vacations. And so when families began coming, they would build summer cottages. And development really boomed. And so people started building these summer cottages, first kind of overlooking the ocean and more of our coastal water bodies. And then when we started running out of space, they would actually begin building around ponds. And so that's where this kind of a Cape Cod cottage trend came from. People were living in these small lots, 0.3 acres or less, really densely kind of situated. And at this point in time, no one was really concerned about environmental or public health when it came to wastewater. And so for families to be able to actually live in these cottages, there would be cesspits or cesspools built. And these really were intended to take waste outside of the household, but didn't really do all that much more. And so developers would build these houses close together. They'd put in these cesspits and cesspools with little separation to groundwater. And essentially, waste would just be piped into our coastal and freshwater bodies. So that's what the beginning of our wastewater tech history looks like on Cape Cod.
Seems kind of appropriate given, the tourism on Cape Cod, that we started with the idea of vacation, and now to this day it's still very prevalent.
Right, exactly. And actually, like, the whole tourism-based economy comes into play a couple decades later. So tourism, again, kicks off in the 50s and 60s. In the 60s, we start to see this demographic shift. So folks who would come and stay here for the summer started retiring on the Cape. We started seeing more of a service economy, too, to accommodate more tourists. And so people started turning these summer residences into year-round residences. But the problem was that, like, the wastewater infrastructure, so, like, these cesspits and cesspools hadn't really been updated or built for year-round flow. And so these start to fail environmentally. No one is really concerned until the late 60s, when we start seeing pond closures due to fecal coliform, which is an indicator of pollution in wastewater, which we'll get to later on. We start to have ordinances asking people to drink bottled water because of contamination in wells. But really, if you look at the history of it, and there's actually an amazing book by a man by the name of Kumbler, I believe. He talks about some of the first studies on wastewater pollution in Cape Cod coming out of Harvard as early as the late 50s. So we knew it was a problem. People didn't really experience this problem until, like, the late 60s or so. But then nothing was really done. And this is because in the 70s, so the 70s is really heralded as, like, the era of environmental protection here. It's when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio sets fire and the EPA is created. The Clean Water Act comes along. And the Clean Water Act is amazing, but the Clean Water Act really came about to regulate point source pollution. And so the Clean Water Act applied to municipal treatment and sewers in cities, but it didn't really help with pollution coming from non-point sources.
Yeah, what's the difference between point source and non-point source?
Totally. So point source can be attributed to, like, one specific source. So like a sewer pipe or like a municipal treatment, whereas non-point source can't really be tracked directly to the source of pollution. So even though we know that septic systems and cesspools lead to pollution, it can't necessarily be tracked to a specific system.
Right, like fertilizer runoff is another non-point source, because it's coming from agricultural fields, but you can't say it's that agricultural fields, really,
Smith
right?
Farm.
And stormwater runoff, all those kinds of things that can't be directly tracked back to a specific source.
Okay.
So in the 70s,
it seems like it would be a lot easier to regulate point source, because you know exactly where it's coming from. So I can see why that it's come further.
Totally.
Or was regulated first.
And so those regulations come about in, like, the 70s, but then they don't really work for non-point source pollution. So in the meantime, in the 70s, there's no federal regulations or rules. We do start to see zoning laws come into effect in Cape Cod. So some of the towns on the Cape begin to take this pollution problem really seriously, and they start regulating development. But the problem is that the tourism economy, like you mentioned, which was so crucial, was still so important and continues to be so important to this day, that when these zoning laws were first introduced, they were probably not enforced as stringently as they should have been, because people were afraid to hinder development, given that it was linked to economic prosperity. So we begin to see zoning laws, but then it's not until, like, I want to say the mid to late 80s, when the EPA comes out with regulations for non-point source pollution. And that happens through the 319 funding. And that was essentially the first time that the federal government provided states money to create programs to regulate and address non-point source pollution. So until this point, until the mid to late 80s, there's really nothing at a federal level regulating non-point source pollution. Up until the mid 90s, Cape Cod, for the most part, is primarily reliant still on cesspools and cesspits, and then septic systems. So septic systems become mandated in the state in the mid 90s because they better protect human health. And they do that through pathogen removal, which we'll talk about in a little while. But so you can still find many households on Cape Cod, also across southeastern New England, and really across the U.S. that, have these grandfathered in cesspits and cesspools. But yeah, so septic systems became the norm in the late 90s, and they're still the norm today here on Cape Cod. Right around this time, we start seeing the development of newer technologies like innovative alternative septic systems. So these are septic systems that are designed to remove other wastewater pollutants that we do research on here at MASSTC. There are regulations kind of currently coming through the pipeline that may be requiring these in certain areas or might call for better protection than septic systems provide. But that's really where we are now, is that 85% of households on Cape Cod still rely on septic systems. There are several municipal treatment plants on Cape Cod. They are few and far between. I think there are 5. And one of the reasons for this is that when federal funding became available in the 80s to essentially install sewers, a lot of the towns were afraid that building a sewer would call for even more uncontrolled growth. And so it was used kind of as an argument to not build a sewer.
Well, that has happened in, lots of cities in the West where they sort of build in some sort of protection for their water quality, and that level of protection ends up just creating more population growth, and now there's not the level of protection, there's just more population. Right. So I can see why they were afraid of doing that in a way.
More population, more contributions.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Sure.
So in a way, trying to, keep your, build in a risk factor just creates more risk.
Right.
Yeah.
And it also illustrates that these decisions about wastewater management are hard.
Yeah.
So that kind of lands us to where we are today. I figured maybe we could go a little bit into some of the contaminants. Since I've mentioned wastewater pollution a couple times, we haven't actually delved into that yet. So pollutants in wastewater, regionally at least in southeastern New England, we hear a lot about pollution in wastewater. Can one of you maybe describe a little bit about what pollution in wastewater means and what would be considered some of the broad categories of these pollutants?
Yeah, you want to take it away?
Sure, yeah. So I would define pollution in wastewater as any of those contaminants that we need to remove before we can use it again. So that would include nutrients. So we'll go a little bit into some of these nutrients, but nitrogen and phosphorus are the ones that we think of. They're usually the ones causing the algal blooms and beach closures. We also think about pathogens. That's something you mentioned about that's sort of why we have the wastewater treatment infrastructure that we do, is to keep us safe from pathogens. And when I say pathogens, I mean bacteria, viruses, some other types of organisms that don't fall into those organisms, but basically anything that's going to make you violently ill from wastewater. And then we also have this third sort of broad category of contaminants of emerging concern. And we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit in more detail later, but it's sort of a catch-all for the contaminants that we don't know exactly what problems they're causing right now, but we know we probably don't want to be drinking lots of these contaminants. This includes pharmaceuticals, illicit drugs, personal care products, PFAS. Like I said, we'll talk about them more specifically later, I think. But
they're basically the things that years from now our children will say, what were you thinking?
Right, exactly.
Contaminants of emerging concern. We just don't know it yet.
Right, exactly.
Probably metals too, if I may interject with,
Yeah.
you know, when you talk about pollution and wastewater, you can also lump metals in there as well. And so I guess too, just to tack a little bit on, you know, we have contaminants, but really pollution and waste and water and wastewater is anything we don't want in there that we wish were not in there before we use the water again too, if you want to think about it even more simply.
And that doesn't mean that they're all bad per se, because some of those.
Well, yeah, right. There maybe the amount of
yeah.
them is bad. Is that what we don't want? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do these nutrients come from? Or like, where do these contaminants come from in our wastewater?
We want to talk about nutrients first?
You want to give a pause?
Yeah, do you want to take a break or jump into nutrients, Alexi?
Let's jump into nutrients.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So I think, it's a good place to start, because I think that is kind of the hot button issue right now, because we'll talk more about pathogens and sort of what we think about those right now. But nutrients is where everyone's head is at as far as protecting water quality, especially here in Cape Cod. So nutrients, just to take like a giant step back, nutrients are those things that we, organisms, plants, animals, what we need to grow. It's a catch-all term for what allows growth. So in this case, we're talking nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, potassium, all those things that are on the backs of the labels of the foods that you eat, right? And we need those to create new cells, to gain energy and to grow. Not just us, I'm saying us, but when I say us, I mean collectively organisms on the planet. And again, we need them to grow. We can't grow without them. And that's true for algae as well. And that's kind of where we get into the problem that we have, is that the same nutrients that allow us to grow, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon specifically, if that stuff gets from our waste stream, from our food, from our waste into surrounding bodies of water, it can cause algal blooms. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to talk about eutrophication. Eutrophication is just a fancy word for too much nutrients. So too much nutrients in a body of water. This is what happens frequently to our ponds in this area when they get closed down, and our estuaries. So in this graphic we see on the screen here, we've got excess nitrogen loading to, in this case, some sort of salt water body. The extra nitrogen is like fertilizer for the algae that's growing there. So the algae get it. They're like, oh, I've been waiting for this nitrogen. And they just like grow like gangbusters. And then when the algae dies, it decomposes. So the carbon and everything in that algae gets eaten up by these little microorganisms that are also having a party because of all this extra food. Those microorganisms, when they decompose the algae, that drives down the oxygen in the water, and then that's the low oxygen is really what causes a lot of the ecological problems. That's what causes fish kills. That's what causes low DO is a really bad environmental parameter. You don't want low dissolved oxygen, and so any nutrient that gets too much. Again, we're usually thinking of nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon is another one. Any of that gets to be too much in a body of water will cause low DO and poor environmental conditions.
So on Cape Cod, most of this nitrogen and phosphorus comes from our wastewater, from our septic systems. What would be other sources of these nutrients? Like what other sources of pollution would kind of contribute to these?
Probably fertilizer would be one of the next ones. Yeah, you'll get some stormwater runoff that'll sweep a lot of things in. And based on conversations I've had, and what's kind of neat about phosphorus, which we'll get into a little bit later, is that it's one of the newer things that we're studying in some ways, at least with innovative alternative technologies. So that is to say there's a lot more that we have to understand, or at least I feel like I have to understand about it, such that in many ways we're confident about nitrogen being in our wastewater, and phosphorus is too, but there are other sources at least for phosphorus. But again, jumping all around here, certainly wastewater. You think of fertilizer, you think of stormwater runoff. We don't have too many farms here on the Cape.
But people have very green lawns.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, especially now in the summer, as people are coming back to their summer homes and they want that pristine lawn.
Right. Not a lot of farms, but the cranberry bogs, they do, there's a lot of
true.
nitrogen that goes into those as well.
That's a good point.
And then right off Cape and other kind of southern New England communities, there are more farms than there are here. So that would probably
That's very true.
Yeah.
Very true. And water is, a shared resource. So it's not as if the Cape Cod beaches are somehow isolated.
Right.
Right. Everything is connected. Do we want to talk a little bit about phosphorus and then go into a break? Or we could go to a break now.
Yeah. Let's take a little break now.
All right, let's do a break now. Please continue to submit your questions to us. Hopefully we can answer them for you live today. And we will see you in 5 to 7 minutes.
Sounds good.
Hey everyone, we are back. Thanks for being with us. We're gonna jump right into phosphorus. Could you explain a little bit what phosphorus is and how it ends up in our wastewater and why it's problematic?
Sure, yeah. Phosphorus, like nitrogen, it's an element. It is a nutrient. Like I was saying, nutrients, we need them to grow. Just like nitrogen and carbon, we need a little bit of phosphorus. The same is true for plants and all animals, algae. But phosphorus is a little bit different than nitrogen, especially when we're thinking about removing it from wastewater. Nitrogen conveniently has a harmless gaseous state. So nitrogen gas, N2, is a big percentage of the air that we're breathing. And so when we go to remove nitrogen from wastewater, the end goal is to get that nitrogen that's in our waste, which is harmful forms of nitrogen, back to nitrogen gas. And it can just bubble out into the atmosphere. And we don't really have to worry about it anymore after we force it through the nitrogen cycle. Phosphorus is pretty different in that it does not have a safe gaseous state. What is the phosphorus gas that George Hoyfelder is always talking?
Phosgene gas.
Yeah.
Maybe even war gas.
Right. So you would not want to breathe it, and that's one of the maybe the only few forms of phosphorus gas. So there's no safe way to make it into a gas to just bubble out and leave like there is for nitrogen. So that makes it trickier in a couple of different ways, and it's tricky in removal. So when we remove phosphorus, we can't just make it bubble away almost like magic. We have to remove it biologically. So that would be getting the microbes that are in the wastewater, sort of setting up the right home for them to absorb a bunch of that phosphorus and get them to take it up, or get plants to take it up. And then you can, harvest the plants that have grown out of like a soil absorption system or rain garden, something like that. You can also do chemical removal. So phosphorus binds readily with some metals, like iron is a really, well-known metal that binds readily with phosphorus. So if you add iron to wastewater, it will form particulates with that phosphorus and pull it out of the water. You can also filter it. You can filter it through a really fine filter. But all of those will require recovery at the end, because again, there's no convenient gaseous state. You have to do something with it. So again,
the point is to immobilize it, make sure it doesn't move into the water.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And you either got to do something to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Why do we hear so much about phosphorus when it comes to freshwater versus kind of our more like estuarine and coastal environments?
Well, as far as I understand, phosphorus is what's called the limiting nutrient typically for ponds. And so, the example I used to use when I was teaching. So limiting nutrients, if you pretend that, let's pretend we're all bakers, right? And we make bread. And
I'm going to skip a few slides here, Brian, just so you know.
So if we pretend we're making bread, and we pretend that outside we have a cow who and I'm sorry, to back it up, pretend when we make bread you need 3 things: eggs, milk, and flour. And let's say outside we have a cow who produces all the milk we could need, and we also have chickens who give us unlimited eggs, but we only have a half acre of flour, or of a field to make that flour. Flours are a limiting nutrient. It doesn't matter how much eggs and how much milk we have. We don't have enough flour, so that's going to dictate how much bread we can make as bakers. And so similarly for a freshwater pond, you could have a whole lot of nitrogen and a whole lot of carbon and potassium and other essential nutrients. But if there's not enough phosphorus, it's gonna curtail and slow how much algae is growing there. But then you introduce that phosphorus, more of it, and all of a sudden that can kick off some things that we humans don't like as far as growth goes.
Yeah. I love the baker analogy. Yeah, that's awesome. You can only make so many loaves of bread if you've only got so much flour. Yeah.
So then that excess phosphorus leads to algal blooms, and it leads to pond closures. Pets get sick, all kinds of things.
Yeah. And so in freshwater, just to like back it up, drive the point home, freshwater ecosystems, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. So in a freshwater body, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen there is. You could keep going and going with the nitrogen pollution, and there's not going to be an algal bloom until you hit it with excess phosphorus. And the exact opposite is true in saltwater, right? So you can have as much phosphorus pollution, doesn't matter how much phosphorus pollution you have in the coastal system. Until there's more nitrogen, there's not going to be an algal bloom. But I will say the Great Lakes are so messed up that they sometimes will switch back and forth, and they have so much nitrogen and so much phosphorus that phosphorus isn't always their limiting nutrient, just because there's so much pollution. Yeah,
That's wild. I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Great Lakes.
We can really mess things up.
Oh man.
Indeed.
Right.
Something that you mentioned before the break that I found really interesting was that carbon was considered pollution, and I never knew that carbon was a wastewater pollutant. Could you give like a little bit of background on like why that is?
Yeah. So I guess what comes to mind first for me, when you have too much carbon going into a system, then you can have a lot of your growth in your soil absorption system, which can then, you think of it's really bacteria who are doing the work, these microbes that live out in the soil. And so if they get too much carbon, what they're going to do is they're going to grow like gangbusters, and then they could potentially die off and form this biomat, which over time, that's, all leach fields, soil absorption systems are synonymous. They all fail eventually. They're going to fail that much quicker. The more carbon you feed it, because the microbes are just going to, build up, die off, and then their little dead bodies are there that cause the wastewater to pool, basically. Cute, yeah.
Yeah, and carbon breakdown in wastewater is like carbon breakdown anywhere. It's just decomposition. So it's the same as when you have a compost pile and you notice that your apple is getting more and more rotten. That is decomposition. The same thing is happening to the carbon in wastewater. Whatever air is in that wastewater stream is being used by those microorganisms to eat the carbon that's in the apple, or in this case, in the waste, which will include all the food that you put down your sink, all of, your feces is chock full of carbon. There's lots of things that have both carbon and nitrogen in them. So there'll be, when you think of proteins, some of the stuff that you eat that has lots of carbon and lots of nitrogen in it. And the algal blooms and the low dissolved oxygen that I was describing before, how, if you put a lot of carbon from your waste stream out, that's not only fuel for some organisms, it's also drives down that dissolved oxygen. So that's really what we're worried about with the carbon, that it will create a low DO environment because there's so much decomposition going on. And so the things that you can do to combat this is actually really easy. And this is probably why you personally, Alexi, don't think of it like in the same realm as nitrogen and phosphorus. All you really have to do is blow air into the water to encourage that decomposition. We measure biochemical oxygen demand, BOD, and that's really just a measurement of how much carbon is in the wastewater stream or in the environment, whatever you're testing. And it indicates how much oxygen is being depleted by that carbon consumption. And it's a big problem, not so much in households. Households, if you don't have like a garbage disposal, you're not going to be putting like tons of carbon into your system. It's not a big deal. But like restaurants, a lot of times will have to have an aerator in their waste stream because they do have a lot more carbon input than a regular house.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned it was easy to get rid of carbon. So just by introducing air, but what is being done right now to get rid of some of these other nutrient pollutants like phosphorus and nitrogen?
At least on the Cape, there's a growing amount of innovative alternative septic systems for sure. There's talk about sewering, and so sewering, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, sewering is when you have your wastewater, instead of being treated in your backyard, it's taken away to a large facility, a wastewater treatment plant where they treat a whole bunch of people's wastewater all at the same time in, large batches, I guess, if you will. And you have these qualified people, these wastewater operators who, essentially know what they're doing to tweak this or adjust that, and so that it'll remove the nutrients, the phosphorus and nitrogen. So in the Cape, a lot of the focus really is moving here as to how we can get nitrogen. A lot of focus on nitrogen because of the saltwater beaches that we love, but phosphorus too, because we also love our ponds. So I would say, that's at least the first thing that comes to mind. But there are other things you can do to mitigate it. I would imagine, although I don't know this for certain, that some towns have fertilizer regulations as far as limiting what you can and can't put on your lawn. I think that there's probably been some talk of change the infrastructure for stormwater and so for example, if you have your stormwater going into the same, it's called a combined sewer, where you have stormwater and your wastewater together, and they all get treated as one. It's not necessarily as efficient if you were to treat your stormwater differently than your wastewater. I'm trying to think what other.
I think some other ones that come to mind are like cranberry bog restoration, so like restoring bogs to the original wetlands that they were, so that they can kind of fix more of like the nitrogen and other elements. Permeable reactive barriers. I know there are some deployed throughout the Cape. I know that can be used to kind of intercept like nitrogen from wastewater, shellfish aquaculture. So there's a lot of different nitrogen reducing technologies, as well as innovative alternative septic systems.
Yeah, fair enough. My brain goes there first. That's a very good point. I can't believe I forgot shellfish.
But then for phosphorus, though, because phosphorus is kind of one of these newer issues that we're seeing in ponds, What kind of technologies are people starting to look at to remove phosphorus from freshwater bodies?
Well, when we think about, if we're thinking specifically about innovative alternative septic systems, there's not a ton of technology. There are a handful of technologies out there, but none of them have general approval in Massachusetts.
I think they're all even at pilot,
yeah,
which is the lowest
Right.
level of approval. It's kind of step one in Massachusetts.
That means there's less than 15 systems statewide of
Wow.
any given phosphorus removal technology. And, I've had some interesting conversations with the manufacturers of these technologies, because frequently it's, manufacturers who are in on-site wastewater, they have different types of systems. They might have a nitrogen removing design. They might have a BOD removing or a carbon reducing design. And they do have some phosphorus removing ideas. It's not like we don't know how, but they've said if there's no regulation, then there's not going to be any market.
An incentive.
Right. If there's no incentive, then there's nothing to drive that forward. I think in places like the Great Lakes that are having more issues, there are things have probably progressed further in terms of phosphorus. But again, a lot of their pollution in that area is from agriculture. So I think we're still sort of figuring it out as far as removing it from wastewater. We've come a long way. Just sort of you were describing the history of these pollutants. We've come a long way in not putting phosphorus in a lot of our products in the first place.
That's true.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the major steps that's probably happened in the last 30 years or so. But as far as removing what's there, I think we still have a really long way to go, not just in finding the technologies, but also just more understanding of phosphorus. It moves very slowly through the ecosystem. And I think that's one hard part about it. That's true of nitrogen, but more so true of phosphorus. We might not see the effects of phosphorus pollution for 50 to 100 years. So it makes it even harder to control it. Yeah.
I remember there's also other kind of technologies that are not so much technologies. There's urine diversion that we can do. So instead of having your wastewater go into your septic system, for example, diverting your urine, which has a lot of the phosphorus in it, from even going in there in the first place, and capturing it and sterilizing it or pasteurizing it and reusing it for other purposes is one way to keep it out of ponds, but that's something that hasn't really been widely applied yet, at least here. I think it would be prudent to move on to maybe pathogens and bacteria, which you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah. I'm going to skip ahead in these slides, Brian.
So a lot of the technologies that I mentioned earlier historically came about to protect human health because people were getting sick. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the different kinds of pathogens and bacteria in wastewater? And can you also demystify what an indicator for pathogens or bacteria is?
Yeah. So I will just give sort of a broad introduction to pathogens in wastewater. I did a little bit at the beginning, but just any of those bacteria or viruses that are going to come from waste or fecal matter and make you sick. We think of rotavirus, norovirus, anything that's, those are called enteroviruses. Just means in your stomach from your intestines. And any of those can potentially make you sick. E. coli is another one, salmonella, cholera, all of these kind of big ones that are going to send you into, digestive distress. And they can come from, poorly treated. Before people understood germ theory, a lot of these traveled just because people were not properly washing their hands. When people started to understand germ theory and started to properly wash their hands, that did take care of a lot of it. But then, we still have to deal with it in our waste. Do you want to talk about indicator species?
Yeah, sure. So we end up sampling a lot of a lot of different types of bacteria. Well, no, sorry, I take that back. I scratched that. We don't actually sample that many. We sample are called indicator species, which tell you, they paint a picture of how much contamination there could be for the ones that we actually do care about. So fecal coliform, E. coli, and Enterococcus too, at least for marine waters, are typically indicator species, and kind of the way you could think about an indicator. So for example, your sample comes back from your pond and it's 200 most probable, or colonies per most probable unit. Now I'm mixing up my units here, but the point being, let's say it's a high number. That's not going to say, oh, there's for sure salmonella in your pond. We didn't test for, polio or whatever. Instead, this number is high, so it could indicate that there could be all those other contaminants. So yeah, you could think of it as, how cool is your party based on the number of popular people that are there. It's like your party could be cool because of the drinks you serve or the food you have, or your bounce house, but you'll be able to tell if there's 20 really popular people there, or if there's a fewer numbers.
And in this analogy, the 20 popular people are fecal coliform bacteria.
Yeah, right, exactly. You don't know if Dave from next door showed up, but the point is, you can count. You say that there were 20, so you could say this was probably a pretty cool party.
Yeah. And as Emily will show, we in our lab we do look at several different types of indicator bacteria, and it's interesting because fecal bacteria is what we sort of just is the blanket term for bacteria that indicates that a warm-blooded animal's poop is in the water. That's like at the very base what it means is that a warm-blooded animal, there is fecal matter in the water. So frequently things can't, like ponds and other bodies of water, do get contaminated with fecal bacteria because there's, let's say, lots of dogs, and people, and people aren't cleaning up after their dogs. You, I'm sure, clean up after your dog. But if because the dogs also have lots of fecal coliforms in their lower intestine. But if we, know that there's not any sort of pollution from other sources, then that's a really good indicator that the fecal bacteria is human fecal bacteria. We can also look at, like Emily Michelle was saying, more specific bacteria. So fecal indicator, again, that's like a really broad group. And then you could also look at a specific one, E. coli. That's a specific fecal indicator. And that one can make you sick.
Yes.
Right. So it's like we can look really broadly and say, there's fecal matter in this pond for whatever reason, and then you kind of look at the land use around it to help you say, okay, it's from wastewater, or it's from pets, or whatever. But then we can also look at really specific bacteria to help us tease out what's going on.
Really cool.
Yeah, and it can. I thought maybe I don't have control over this anymore. I was going to go to the next slide, but that's okay. I was just going to mention that we talked a lot about algal blooms closing beaches, but bacteria counts are frequently what closes beaches to like shellfishing and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, those are the signs you often will see on the Cape. They'll post it if a beach is closed.
Yeah.
So we monitor a lot of our beaches and our ponds usually during the summer, but just because they're not being monitored outside of the summer doesn't mean that these might not be present, correct?
Oh no, they're probably still there. It's just that it's not really time for swimming, and I would imagine temperature plays a role.
Temperature plays a role. There's not as much. We're not producing as much wastewater on the Cape in the winter. So I think there's several things that play a role into us not being as concerned in the winter. And if you're thinking about nitrogen and algal blooms, that's not really going to happen in the winter, even if there's just as much nitrogen because it's so temperature dependent.
Okay. Excellent point. We had one of our participants ask about PFAS. They wanted to learn a little bit more about PFAS. So PFAS, and I will attempt to pronounce the full name, but I'm probably going to butcher it. Polyfluoroalkyl substances.
Yeah, that's
got it.
Per and poly.
Yeah, I was say
per and poly.
Per or poly. Yeah, it's a really broad category also.
Okay. But yeah, so PFAS is something that we've been hearing a lot about regionally and also nationally, right? Because weren't there just kind of national regulator?
Right. EPA just passed a drinking water standard for PFAS, I believe.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip here forward on the slides.
So what are PFAS and where do they come from?
Yeah, I'd call them, they're a broad group of chemicals that we're still trying to understand. They're basically used to repel water and stains, and so they oh gosh, history is not my forte, so I don't remember when it is that they came about. Jump in and help me if you know. But they kind of became more prevalent at a certain point in recent-ish history, such that they were added to.
I'm going to say post World War II.
Post World War II, I like
sounds
it.
right.
There we go. It's
Well,
really,
it kinda
it's
has
more
to be.
accurate
Yeah, it has to be.
than my nebulous recently. But you know, there are these chemicals that were, you know, or compounds, I should say, that were put into cookware to repel water, so that way, you know, you have anti-stick cookware. You have almost not just rain gear, but clothing that will you know, stop water from coming through. Firefighting chemicals.
Yep, the fire foam that they use. That's one of the big ones, is the fire foam. Because, you know, I mean, the kind of scary thing about PFAS is they're not ubiquitous, but nearly so. They are in many products. That
And our
we use.
mascara.
It's in our mascara. You know,
I like that's the first thing you go to.
I know,
and
like,
mascara.
In our takeout containers.
Yeah,
but like
true.
our mascara.
Yep.
yeah, I mean, our clothing, you know, women's menstrual products. It's in almost everything.
much,
They, you know, I don't want to be too like scary hyperbolic, but like I have heard other scientists refer to it as like our generation's DDT, that we're going to find, you know, again, like Emily Michelle was saying, this is a contaminant of emerging concern. Our the generations that are going to come after us are going to say, why were you putting this in your cookware? Why were you putting this in your clothing?
Right.
And so it's, you know, it's hard to find blood samples that don't contain some PFAS. It's, you know, in similar ways to micro and nanoplastic, it's becoming just everywhere. So that's kind of scary doom and gloom. But as you were saying, the EPA did just form a drinking water regulation around it. Not to get too nitty gritty here, but one of the interesting things about PFAS is the way that it's regulated. Again, this is like brand new. We're just really learning how to detect a lot of these things. But it does seem like it accumulates in wastewater, like sludge, like the solid parts of wastewater. And this is why it's become such a like newsworthy thing, is because that sludge that's used in waste, that is like the end product of wastewater treatment, that can be used agriculturally because it's still got lots of nutrients in it after it's been treated. But in Maine, where they were spreading this sludge agriculturally for feeds, for animal feed, cows' milk started coming back with high levels of PFAS. And that's what started this whole thing, which is like why we're like, oh, we need to be worried about this.
Right.
And so it's really tough to sort of regulate on the ends where, you know, there's already tons of the PFAS in the water, in the sludge. And now we have to figure out some way to remove it. And we're just at the beginning of figuring out how to detect and remove these things.
And this is a contaminant that does not break down naturally.
That's the big thing about it. Yeah, I guess I should have already said that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one reason it's that analogy with DDT is that we don't know about its bioaccumulation, yet bioaccumulation is when it, like, you know, something that you ingest a lot gets saved up in your body. So like mercury or DDT did that, you know. But yeah, we don't know what the health effects are yet. And like you were saying, it does not break down easily. We're still working on breaking it down.
So are there technologies currently being developed, or is there research currently underway to see whether and how we can remove PFAS from our wastewater?
I would hope so.
The ones I know of are in their infancy, I would say. There's nothing that I'm aware of that is ready to be deployed at any sort of scale. So yeah, I think we really are just, again, from where I'm sitting, we're learning how to analyze for these things, how to detect them, and figuring out what is a dangerous level. Do they bioaccumulate? Answering some of these really sort of basic questions. Which is kind of scary because it's already so ubiquitous.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the tricky thing that I have, you know, been told is with chemicals is you assume that they're innocent until proven guilty, which is kind of tricky to assume.
Yeah.
We had a knock at the door.
Hey guys,
Hey, what's up, Brian?
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I got some really important news hot off the press
You
here.
have
Oh
some
my gosh.
news hot off
Check
the
this
press.
So MASSTC is going to be releasing their Title V regulation update today at 2 o'clock, like
The
any minute.
DEP
Right now.
regulation update.
Isn't that
Hot
unbelievable?
off the presses.
Wow.
Crazy big news.
DEP regulation coming out at 2 p.m. What time is
What
it?
time is it?
It's like any minute. I think
In
it's
2
Wow.
minutes. We should start a countdown.
Wait, this is incredible. We're living wastewater history.
So I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I just had to
Thank
come
you
in with
so
that really
much.
important news.
Thank you, Brian.
Oh my
No
gosh.
problem. Enjoy the rest of your potty talk.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so how about we take this opportunity to maybe take a quick break and then come back in about 5 minutes and talk a little bit more about some of the other pollutants and maybe even touch briefly on the press release.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Be right back.
All right, everyone. We are back. That was a really exciting 5 minutes for us. We didn't have a chance to read through any of the amendments to the regulation we just mentioned. Basically, today, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, or MASSTC, released amendments to Title V, which is really the environmental code that regulates septic systems in Massachusetts. And so this is significant because there were proposed changes essentially either requiring towns on the Cape to have essentially their communities install IA systems within 5 years to meet pollution limits, or to develop watershed permits, which is most likely the route that most towns on Cape Cod will take. These permits basically require the town to come up with an adaptive management strategy, so adaptive ways to reduce problematic nutrient loading. So like all of the nutrients we talked about before, like phosphorus, nitrogen, but these are focused on nitrogen. But anyways, the permits would require towns to come up with a 20-year plan to reduce nitrogen loading in impaired water bodies. And so these regulations were just released. Again, we haven't had a chance to go through them. This is an issue that folks are really concerned and passionate about. And as we know, Cape Cod is in a water quality crisis. And so if not our next, then the after next potty talk will probably focus on specifically breaking down these regulations and explaining what they mean in more regular terms. So beyond that, we just wanted to wrap up our conversation about pollutants in wastewater. We had just talked a little bit about PFAS. Could you just touch on maybe some of the other types of contaminants of emerging concern that we find in our wastewater and that we are concerned about?
Yeah, so some of the big ones, let's see, other than PFAS, we've got pharmaceuticals and micro and nanoplastics, personal care products, illicit drugs that many of them don't get broken down very much in your system. Yeah, am I forgetting anything, Emily Michelle?
Caffeine comes to mind. That's
Caffeine.
not an illicit drug.
No, yeah, just a regular drug.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, caffeine is that's a really interesting one because it we were talking about those fecal indicator species that we can look at that are, the bacteria that live in digestive systems that can tell us, okay, this water is contaminated with probably wastewater. Caffeine is another really good indicator of if your water body is if the problem is wastewater. It doesn't cause any problems itself, except maybe like hyping up the fish. I don't know. But it doesn't get broken down. And so if there's like high levels of a caffeine in your water, again, it's probably from wastewater.
Okay. And then what about, did we mention artificial sweeteners?
Excuse me, that's another good one. I don't think we talked about
I don't think we did
those.
either.
Yeah.
It's in the same group as caffeine, where it's like probably not doing anything terribly environmentally, but artificial sweeteners don't get broken down easily. So if you find high concentrations of those in your water bodies or groundwater, again, probably from wastewater.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so what are some of the ways that we get rid of some of these CECs, or are these still kind of under investigation?
It's still under research still.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of like with, I can't remember what I said before, but there was something that I mentioned, just not phosphorus. That's what it was. Just we've reduced the amount of phosphorus that we're using in products. So I'd say the best thing we can do is reduce our use of these things. Obviously, pharmaceuticals, people need to take medicines. That's not something that you can reduce, but personal care products, microplastics is another big one. Just by keeping your plastic out of the environment, making sure that it gets to the facility it actually needs to go to and doesn't end up in the ecosystem.
Using less of it if you can.
Less of it, yeah. And just being a more thoughtful consumer, which is difficult. And it shouldn't be that it shouldn't be the weight is on the consumer, but in this case, it is. And because we don't have a lot of great technologies to remove these.
It's probably worth just briefly mentioning too, as far as pharmaceuticals, certainly people have to take their medicine, but if you are done with the medicine, I think you can bring it to your local health department as opposed to flushing it down the drain.
Yeah, don't put it down. Don't put your pharmaceuticals down the drain when you're done with them. That's a great point.
Awesome. So in the interest of time, I think that probably wraps up our discussion on contaminants. We did get a couple great questions from participants during registration that I wasn't necessarily able to kind of weave into today's episode. One of these questions was, how can we speed up the OK for IA systems on Cape Cod? What comes to mind immediately for me is, first of all, looking at data maybe from other states around us that use technologies that we might not use here, that are used in climatically similar environments. So that could help us determine whether certain technologies work as well as they should, and whether that would be an IA system that we would want to use on the Cape. Funding, it can be really expensive to develop and get technology approvals for some of these technologies in the state. So more sources of federal and state funding to kind of kickstart the development of newer IA technologies that perform better would be really important. Did you want to talk a little bit briefly about the technology approval process here?
Sure. Yeah. It can be arduous because for general approval, an IA system, say you have a great nitrogen removing system that you would like to solve the problem in Massachusetts, you would have to go through 2 to 3 steps of step-ups of approval, and that last step is for general approval. You need 50 systems to go in, so you have to have 50 homeowners who are willing to put in a not generally approved system, and then you have to monitor that system for at least 3 years to make sure that it's performing the way that it wants to, which is great from a consumer protection standpoint,
right.
And it can be difficult from a manufacturer standpoint, or if you're in the position of just wanting to get a great working technology to market so it can solve the problem. It can be difficult.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we also had a question about, so this one pertains specifically to nutrient pollution from golf courses. Someone asked, what is the impact of golf courses on Cape Cod? I am no expert on this, so we might tap on Brian, who's behind the scenes doing some tech stuff for us, to tackle this question.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. I get to
Man
stay
behind the
behind.
curtain.
I get to stay behind the curtain today and operate all the machinery, which is fun. I mean, golf courses definitely do have an impact in our watersheds across Cape Cod. We have a lot of golf courses around here. People love to come. They love to golf, which is great. But unfortunately, we tend to use fertilizer to make those greens green. And in some cases, those fertilizers run off into our freshwater and marine embayments. There are some towns that are looking at ways to control those nitrogen inputs, particularly the town of Brewster is looking to control, I think it's the Captain's Golf Course, which feeds into the Pleasant Bay estuary system. And the way they're doing that is to use something called fertigation, where essentially what you do is capture a plume of groundwater that has a lot of nitrogen in it from your fertilization activity, and you pump it up, and then you apply it to the land surface again and try to get a second pass with that fertilizer content and with that water. So that's one of the options that's being looked at. And then, of course, reduction of fertilizer on golf courses, generally speaking, as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for tackling that, Brian.
Sure.
So do we have any other questions coming in through the live chat?
Not at the moment.
Okay. So we got some really great questions from folks who had registered for this webinar in advance. Podcast. Folks are interested in learning about wastewater success stories. I think that would be an amazing future Potty Talk podcast. There's a lot of interest in eco-sanitation. And urine diversion. So instead of the idea of kind of just getting rid of our waste, capturing those nutrients in our wastewater and reusing them in agriculture and other sources. There was interest in looking at changes that just came through on the Clean Water Act.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Clean Water Act has changed pretty significantly. I'm not sure if everyone is aware of that, but yeah, there's no longer protection for like ephemeral pools, and basically if the body of water isn't connected year round to a lake or a lake, sea, ocean, or river,
Navigable waters.
Then it's no longer protected, which is pretty devastating for wetlands. And wetlands, all of the contaminants that we're talking about, one of the best things that we have to filter these out of the ecosystem is wetlands. So the fact that we don't have as many protection for those is not good for all of the contaminants that we've been talking about.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yikes is right.
So that would be a great future episode, not to get too much off on the tangent, but
So we have a lot of really good fodder for future episodes. Again, one of the next episodes, if not the next episode, will probably focus on some of the regulation changes that were just released a couple of minutes ago. And please keep sending in your questions. We will announce the next Potty Talk hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And we really appreciate your participation and your input. It's really awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.